Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Okay, so you are in two groups, and I was just notified by the other lecturer that she is tight. So the other group, please, when you come, you mute yourself. So the other group, I don't know whether they've joined. Those group are the very other centers. Your lecturer is
Yes, please. We are here.
those of you whose your lecturer is Dr. Salome Foriapia. Are you here?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
Hey, what about my students?
Sir, we are here.
Oh, okay. But it should be 100 plus if the two groups are joining. Anyway. Okay, so we are going to look at psychology as a course, and you are HR students, so one will ask that why study psychology? Why is it that HR professionals or HR students you study psychology? And you know, human resource professionals, they manage people. So once they manage people, when they study psychology, it helps them to interpret people's behavior. And by understanding how and why people behave, they will be able to motivate such people. They will be able to resolve conflicts and in the end have a positive work culture. A positive work culture. So that is why as HR students, you also have to study psychology. And as we can see, we are saying that psychology is a scientific study. Psychology is a scientific study. And by scientific study, we are saying that it combines the words from Greek, that is the psyche and the logos, where the psyche is life and the logos is explanation or meaning. So we are trying to explain the meaning of life. That is what psychology is. So this definition, as it says, that is the core identity of psychology, the study of the mind and behavior. That is the core of psychology. And it goes ahead to say that psychology includes the study of conscious and unconscious phenomena, as well as feelings and thoughts. It seeks to understand the emergent property of the brain. It seeks to understand the emergent property of the brain and all the overall phenomena linked to those emergent properties. So that is what psychology basically is. So what you need to understand about psychology is that it studies the mind and behavior. The whole core identity of psychology is to study human beings, their mind. So psychology studies the mind. And we ask ourselves that how is it that the mind that is not seen can be studied? So as we move ahead, we will see that psychologists use human behavior as the data to study the human mind. So that is why we say that it is a study of mind and behavior. And as I said, it is the core identity. So example is that if a psychologist studies stress, the psychologist studying stress might examine the worrying thoughts in your mind and the resulting behavior so as to solve that stress situation for you. So it's a mental process and what you show at the end of the mental process. Then, as we continue by saying that it studies conscious and unconscious phenomena, what it's saying is that psychology isn't only about what we are aware of, that's the consciousness. It doesn't only study what we are aware of, where we can see in the second paragraph, it includes the study of conscious and unconscious phenomena. So it's what it means is that when we talk about psychology, it is not about what we are aware of. It is also, or it also digs into hidden influences. That's the unconsciousness, things that are also hidden, not only the ones that we are aware of. Those unconscious fears are also part of the study of psychology. So that is why it studies both the conscious and unconscious. Sometimes, or as we are now, there are things that we do, we can't even give explanations to it. But a psychologist can study and have conversation with you to know that you had that unconsciously during childhood. Sometimes when you work with a colleague for a number of years, people see you and say that you talk like this person. Your actions are. So that is how unconsciously sometimes we even what learn. So that is what psychology is also. It's a field that combines the brain science or partners the brain science and other biologists as a basis of our mental life. So mostly it is used by these doctors and clinical psychologists. Mostly they study more of psychology to know sometimes fear of patients, a conscious fear of patients, and also to uncover maybe any unconscious childhood belief that they are not good enough. There are people who may say, for me, I'm not good enough. And a psychologist will delve into it and realize that such fear or such saying emanated from the person's childhood. Emanated from the person's childhood. So that is what basically the concept of psychology is. The study of the mind and behavior. That is what you need to know. And in addition, it studies or it includes the study of consciousness and unconsciousness, what we are aware of and what we are not aware of. And as a science, as we saw from the first definition, scientific study, as a science, psychology is not a natural science or a physical science, but it's a social science. It's a social science that aim to understand individuals and groups by establishing principles and researching specific cases. So all that you need to know is that even though psychology is a scientific study, it is a social science. And anytime we say social science, we mean people, or we are relating with it with relationship. Once we are in a community, the social there has to do with in our interactions with one another. So the study of our interactions, and our interactions exhibit our behavior. So psychologists study our behavior in a society, and a lot of things that we do. So what you need to understand is that even though it is a science, it is not a natural science, but a social science. Now, with the next one, we look at some history of psychology as a discipline. Some history of psychology. And all that we are talking about in terms of history stem from two dominant perspectives, the structuralism and the functionalism. The structuralism and the functionalism. And this set up the historical context. It explains psychology's first major task of figuring out how to study the mind. So by this history, it was its first time that the proponent of these two dominant perspectives was trying to figure out how we can study their mind. So on their quest to know how we can study their mind, they came out with two foundational and competitive approach, or competing approaches. So first one was founded by HUM201D, which aimed to break down mind into basic structure. So the first one that came, which is the structuralism, and was given the name to this approach by William Want from 1832 to 1920. And as I said earlier, he focused on breaking down mental processes into three basic components. That is what he did. So, for instance, how a natural scientist, like for instance, somebody who is a chemist, and we say water is made up of hydrogen, two hydrogens, and oxygen. So if a chemist break down water into hydrogen and chemist, so that is how he also, when he was studying the mind, he didn't study it as a whole, but broke down the components of the mind. So according to him, for an example is that if a structuralist is analyzing an experience, or the experience of one eating an apple. So if such a person should describe the basic sensation with respect to eating the apple, a structuralist is not interested in the person saying, oh, the apple tasted good and that is all. The structuralist would want to know basic component about that sensation. Probably the color of the apple, how crunchy the sound is, sweet taste, smooth texture. So in eating the apple, the feelings the person had was not generalized, but broke down how the feelings were. So that is how the structuralists also use in studying the mind, breaking down it into basic components. And once we understand this basic component, we will be able to understand the mind, or study the mind properly. So he was important because he separated psychology from philosophy. He separated psychology from philosophy by analyzing the workings of the mind in a more structured way, with the emphasis of being objective measurements and control. Now, when we talk about philosophy, it has to do with beliefs. It has to do with beliefs of people, the idea of people, the theory of people. And sometimes this belief cannot be scientifically proven. So according to him, in order for other people to be able to also study it, because we say psychology is scientific, then he gave out the structured way. So once you know that this is the structured way of trying to understand the human mind, other people can also do same. So that is why he was able to separate it from philosophy. Now, in understanding the human mind or studying the human mind, he relied on what we call trained introspection. Trained introspection. A research method where subject related what was going on in their minds while performing the task. So sometimes when we say introspection, it's more or less like the thing that you are doing, the thinking behind what you are doing. That is the introspection. So he had a group of people to work for them. And as they finished performing the task, the proponent or the founder tried to understand what was going on in the minds of these people while performing those particular tasks, to know or to steady their mind by that. However, it provided, or this particular introspection technique was proved to be unreliable method because there was too much individual variations in the experience and the report of the research. So assuming they were 20 that were performing the same job, and after that they were asked what was going through their mind when they were performing the task, they realized that from person 1 to person 20, there was a lot of variations in their thinking or what was going into their mind. So it wasn't reliable. Now, despite the failure of this introspection, he is the first person in history to open a lab dedicated to psychology in studying the mind, in studying the mind. So that is what basically the structuralism is. He believed that the best way to study the mind was to deconstruct it, and by deconstructing it, breaking it down into components, breaking it down into components. And he used the introspection method to explain how we can study the mind. So structuralists will gather data through trained introspection or self-observation that we spoke about. Now, during that same period, then another proponent, pioneer of the functionalism also came to bear, which focused rather on the purpose of the mind, not the structure of the mind. So they disagreed, or William James disagreed with the functionalism, and rather was asking the question, what are, or instead of you asking what are the parts of the mind, he rather asked, what is the mind for? So the functionalism is based on the premise of what the mind is used for. So he was saying that our mental processes exist because they help us to adapt, they help us to survive, and function in our environment. So that is what the mind is used for. So a person who is a functionalist in this case, unlike the structuralism that will break the mind or the memory into parts, they will rather ask the question, what is the purpose of our memory? Is it to learn from the past, to navigate through the present and plan for the future, which is survival? So that is what they were looking at in studying the mind. That what is the mind for? What is our memory for? Our memory is for us to learn from our past, navigate the present that we are in, and also prepare for the future. So that is what they believed in. So they debunked what the structuralism is saying. So as we can see, he argued that the mind is constantly changing and it is pointless to look for structure of the conscious experience. So that is why they disagreed with the first proponent or the structuralist. So he said that psychologists should look for underlying cause of behavior and mental processes involved. And the underlying cause of behavior is what I said earlier. Is what I said earlier. What is mind for? Please, I said when you mute yourself. Who is that? Charity, please, can you mute yourself? Okay, thank you. So that is what he was looking at, as we can see in that last paragraph, that James suggested psychology should look for the underlying cause of behavior and mental processes involved. What is the mind for? What is the purpose of our mind? So this emphasizes on the cause and consequence of behavior. The cause and consequence of behavior has influenced contemporary psychology. So that is what he came up with. And these are the two traditional history or the earlier history with respect to psychology, the structuralism and the functionalism. The structuralism is saying that to study the mind, you have to deconstruct it. You have to break down it into its component to study what goes into the mind. Then the functionalism disagreed by saying that there are a lot of things that goes through the person's mind, and that we should rather look out for what the mind is used for. And as I cited an example, maybe to understand our past, navigate the present, and also face for the future, or use that to face for the future. So these are the two earlier perspectives with respect to what psychology is. Now we look at psychology and other disciplines. And when we talk about psychology, as we can see, that it is a multifaceted discipline. And by multifaceted, it means that it includes many subfields. Psychology includes human development, it includes sports, it includes health, clinical, social behavior, and cognitive process. So it is the intersection of a lot of disciplines: biology, medicine, linguistics, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and artificial science are all intersections of psychology. So it combines a lot of disciplines together. In every discipline, when you take medicine, there's psychology there, biology, there is a psychology there. Philosophy, psychology, anthropology, sociology, and even the use of artificial intelligence are all, or they all use psychology. So when we talk about psychology and other disciplines, that is what we mean. When we talk of psychology and other disciplines, that is what we mean. So it connects with other disciplines. And here, what it's trying to say is that it is not isolated. Psychology is not isolated. It is the intersection of most sub areas. For you to understand biology very well, you need to study psychology. For you to study medicine, there is that psychology aspect. Because a human behavior and the mind can be studied from biology, can be studied from social angles. So you realize that we have the neuropsychology, which combines psychology and biology, because it's also a field. We call it neuropsychology. That studies the brain, which is biology, and adds psychology to it. So the study of how the brain damage from a stroke or whatever, and how it affects a person's personality and the ability of a person to talk. So that is a typical example of the psychology and other discipline. And all that it is telling us is that psychology lies as the intersection of a lot of discipline. And for you to better understand what psychology is, so or what a particular field is, you need to study the mind. And studying the mind is what we call the psychology. Is what we call the psychology. Now we look at what we have here, which is saying that human behavior, the raw data of psychology. Human behavior, the raw data of psychology. What this particular portion is saying is that one of the major challenges of psychologists is the study of the mind. Is the study of the mind. How can we study something that is invisible and complex as the mind is? How can we study something? The thing, it is not visible. We cannot see our mind. And sometimes we used to say that the best gift that God gave us is our mind, because nobody knows what you are thinking. Nobody knows what is going through your mind. So that is a complex thing to study if people say they want to study. So it is a fundamental problem. It's a fundamental problem in psychology. How do you study a thought of somebody, the emotions of somebody, memories? All these things cannot be seen, neither can they be touched directly, unlike the objects that we see in other science. You cannot open someone's head and see the person's memory or measure the love of a person. You open someone's head to know the magnitude of love of that person. You cannot do that. So what they say is that, or what they came out is that, to study a human behavior, human's mind, we get to know of such, or what is going in through the person's mind, through the person's behavior, because it is the behavior that we can observe. So we see that the answer to this problem or this challenge, which is complex, that we cannot study the mind, the answer to this challenge is that the psychologists will use observable behavior as their primary data. As their primary data. So that is what basically it is. That is what basically it is. So the mind is highly complex and enigmatic. Many wonder how psychologists can study such intricate and seemingly abstract and sophisticated thing. We cannot see it. So all that they came out, which is the last, which is the last paragraph of that. So for a psychologist, human behavior is used as evidence or at least an indication. So you see, you have the term or at least, because it is so complex. So the only thing that they can use to study what is going through your mind is your behavior. So when we talk about the human mind or human behavior as the data, the human behavior as the data for psychology, that is what we mean. What we mean is that it is a complex mechanism to study. So we can only know what goes into a person's mind through the behavior, which acts as an evidence or at least an indication of how the mind functions. So we, as it goes ahead to say, we are unable to observe the mind directly. However, virtually, all our actions, our feelings, our thoughts, and other things we say are influenced by the functioning of our mind. So for us to act, it is our mind. Our feelings is also based on our mind. So this is why behavior is used as a raw data for testing psychological theories on how the mind functions. So that is what basically we say or we talk about with respect to psychology. And if you look at the first definition that we saw, which stated that psychology is a scientific study of the mind and behavior. And behavior. So that behavior is the raw data. Is the raw data that we use to study the human mind. Now, perspective, apart from the dominant perspective with respect to the history of psychology that we spoke about, the structuralism and the functionalism, there were all it opened door for other new perspective. These two perspective, earlier perspective, opened the door for other people to study the mind and come out with their perspective or their understanding of psychology. So it brings about the modern perspective. And the first of this modern perspective is the psychoanalysis. The psychoanalysis. And by the psychoanalysis, here we say that it was founded by Sigmund Freud, and he was a dominant in this paradigm or in this studying of the psychology in the early 20th century. And according to him, he believed that people could be cured by making conscious their unconscious thoughts and motivation. That's gaining insights. People could be cured by making conscious their unconscious thoughts and motivation. And according to his psychoanalysis, he, based on that analysis, came out with this, what we call the psychodynamic theory that helped in studying the human mind. So, according to him, it's just the first version of the broader category. and it includes that lot of theories that we spoke about. So all that we need to know here is that after the structuralism and the functionalism, other new perspective came. And this psychodynamic theory or psychoanalysis, as we move along today, we are going to go deeper into it. But here we are supposed to know that apart from the two major perspectives with respect to psychology, other new ones came. Other new ones came. So we had the behavioralism, we have the humanistic or humanism as all part of the perspective. So we look at five major perspectives, and the first one is the humanistic perspective. The humanistic perspective. Now, when we look at the humanistic perspective, that's the proponent of this humanistic perspective. I think before the humanistic, we have the first one over there, which is behavioral. Yes. So that is this first point. So the classic contemporary perspective in psychology to adopt strategies were the behavioralists, who were renowned for their reliance on controlled laboratory tests and rejecting. So that's an aspect of the earlier perspective. That's the aspect of the earlier perspective. So they were rejecting, or they rejected studying of the mind because of the laboratory that was created. So they reacted strongly to field statement and declared that only observable, measurable behavior was valid for scientific study. So don't forget that with respect to the field psychodynamic, as he was also looking at making, if you want to cure somebody, we use the unconscious to make them conscious. If somebody is not conscious about something, we use that unconsciousness to make that person conscious. And another proponent, which is a behavioralism, came in to state that something that is not seen cannot be studied. So if you want to study the mind scientifically, then it must be something that is observable. So they also rejected the field argument by making the unconscious conscious, something that we don't know. The mind, or it dismissed that mental state, and it says that that is unscientific. It is a black box. We don't know what is in a person's mind. So that is the behavioralism. Then the humanistic came in as a third force. Then the humanistic, so later the humanistic approach became the third force in psychology. So that is what we looked at. So that gave out the five components of the new perspective. The new perspective. Now, we look at the first one, which is the humanistic perspective, which is what? Holistically studying a whole person. Holistically studying a whole person from their own viewpoint. Now, what the humanistic perspective believes in is that you cannot understand a person by just separating or by studying separate behaviors of the person. If you want to study a person, you must consider the whole individual. You must consider the whole individual and understand their own subjective experience of the world. So that is the humanistic perspective. So if something is going on in the mind of a person, or a person is acting in a certain way, according to the humanistic, even though you might know what is causing that person to act in that manner. You don't only look at the symptoms of what is that or the symptoms of that behavior, but rather try and understand from the person himself his personal feeling about the whole thing. It is when you understand from the person's feeling, that is when you're able to even cure the person. So if a therapist, a humanistic therapist, is treating a person with depression, for instance, yes, there are symptoms of depression, but you don't rely on the depression to think that you are going to solve it. Now, what a humanistic therapist will do is that they would want to understand the unique world of their client, of the person who is depressed. Understand the person's personal feeling of emptiness, their lost dreams, and their capacity of healing. So when you understand from them very well, that is when you are able to even resolve the depression. But if you say it is symptoms, so you put the person in a room, thinking that you will be able to resolve such issue, you cannot. So according to the humanistic perspective with respect to psychology, we need to study the whole of a person from their own viewpoint. So as you do so, you'll be able to understand what goes through their mind, to be able to understand. So that is what basically it is. Excuse me, I don't know who is disturbing me with call. Okay. So I understand why the person called. It's about yourselves. So I think the model that was given to you is different from the one I'm using. Is that so? From the individual?
Yes, please.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
please. I even tested you before.
Yes, your model is different from ours.
Yes. So I think I notified them 3 days ago. The model you have has not been used for almost three years. Yes, we have stopped using that model, and this is the current one that we are using. So I will try and send it to the course rep to be forwarded to you. I think there was a group page also. So I will try and join, and I sent it to one of you, I think Doreen or something, so that you all join and I post those particular model. So this is the new model that we are using. The,
Hello,
the, the,
sir.
the, the one that was given to you, I think is the psychology of personnel management. And that is not the general psychology that we are looking at. Yes,
Sir,
Gloria.
hello. Yeah,
Yes,
please,
Gloria.
I sent it to the page. I sent the one you have to the page.
The one I'm using now on the page.
Yes, please.
Oh, okay.
Which
When
page
I
are you
want,
talking about, please?
Please, some of us, we are
Please,
not on
can
the
you
page, oh, please.
Yes.
Please, what? Which page?
Hello?
Please, oh, me too. I'm not on the page. Oh. We are at KTI Business Center.
The link given to us, you will see the WhatsApp links. Just click on it. You will be able to join the WhatsApp group.
Okay, so as we were talking about, so this is the model that you are going to use. So the last paragraph is saying that the humanistic perspective suggests that we are each responsible for our own happiness and our well-being as humans. That is why we need to understand the person's view about the whole situation if we really want to resolve an issue. Okay, then we have the cognitive perspective. Please, I'm coming. Okay. So we look at another perspective, which is a cognitive perspective. The cognitive perspective. And by the cognitive perspective, they study the internal mental processes like our thinking, our memory, and our attention. And according to them, the cognitive perspective, they are saying that like the software, like this perspective is like the software, the study of the mind. And if you want to study the mind, you investigate how we process information, how we take it in, how we store it, and how we use it for problems and decision making. So that is what basically the cognitive is. So it says that it revolves around the notion that if we want to know what makes people think, then the way to do so is to figure out what processes are actually going on in their mind. And as it says, in other words, psychologists from this perspective study cognition, which is a mental act or a process by which knowledge is acquired. So it is all with our mental function, our memory, our perception, and our attention. So that is what basically the cognitive perspective is. So for example, if somebody is a psychologist and the person is a cognitive psychologist, which is trying to study our mental steps or the steps we use to multiply, to do our multiplication. So if I ask you right now, what is 50 times 100? Somebody will just multiply the 5 by 1 and add the 3 zeros and say 5,000. So the steps that we use in our multiplying in our head, or the strategies we use to remember even our new friend's name, is the processes that they also study. You find out that you have a new friend, you meet the person maybe twice or thrice, you see the person from afar, then you try to recall the person's name. So the processes that we use as that memory, trying to remember, it's what we call the internal mental process. That is the cognitive perspective. They study what goes through the mind, like our thinking, our memory, and our attention. Now they compare the mind to a computer by looking at the inputs, the process, and the outputs. So with a cognitive perspective, they try to study the human mind as a computer. So it views, let me highlight that, it views people as being similar to computer in the way we process information. In the way we process information. Inputs, process, and outputs. So for example, the human brain and the computer processing information, or both the brain and the computer will process the information, will store the information, and have input and output procedure. So this has led to the cognitive psychologists to explain that memory comprises of 3 stages. How we receive it, that's the encoding. How we store it, how we retain it, and how we retrieve it. So that is what the cognitive perspective is. They compare the human mind to computer and explains the 3 stages of memory. How we encode it, how we receive it, and how we decode it, or we retrieve from storage. So if you carefully look at a new phone number, you repeat it to yourself to hold it in your memory. So for instance, if you have a close friend and that person calls you and don't know the number, you're able to know that, okay, this last digit 55 is for this person, or this person's number is 55, or you study the whole number. And on number of times, you realize that you are able to save that person's number on your memory. Whenever the person calls, or even when you don't have your phone, you can successfully recall or read out the number. So you only forget if these 3 stages fail. You are not able to encode it, you are not able to store it, and you are not able to what? Retrieve it. Yeah, boy, your hand is up. Yeah, boy, please, your hand is up. Oh, okay. So it is an extremely scientific approach and typically uses what? Lab experiment to study human behavior. So the cognitive process or approach has many applications, including the cognitive therapy and the eyewitness testimonies. So that is what they use in understanding the human mind. Then we have the biological perspective. The biological perspective. And by looking at the biological perspective, all that we are talking about, or the biological perspective are saying, is that all thoughts and behaviors have a physical cause in the body. All thoughts and behaviors have a physical cause in the body. You realize that we said with respect to the cognition that how we store data, input data, store it and retrieve it, more or less like a software mechanism. Here it is looking at it in a hardware explanation. So the biological perspective argues that to understand psychology, we must understand biology of the brain, the nervous system, the hormones, and the genetics. If you want to understand the human mind or why people behave in a certain way, for us to be able to understand why people behave in a certain way, we need to understand the biology of the brain, the nervous system, the hormones, the genetics. Sometimes a lady will behave in a certain manner, which ordinarily she might not behave in that manner. You go and ask her, and she will tell you that as for us women, we go through hormonal changes. So sometimes based on a particular hormone and the kind of behavior they exhibit, some of them may be not being good ones. So that is what the biological perspective also holds. That for us to understand why we behave, we need to rather understand the brain, our nervous system, our hormone, and even genetics, the genes we take from our parents. So sometimes you act in a certain manner, they tell you that you are behaving like your grandmother, you are behaving like your father. So they are trying to state that to understand why we behave in a certain manner, we need to understand the biology aspects. So that is what the whole concept about this biological perspective is talking about. to study the brain, the genetic, the hormones, and the immune system. How genes affect behavior, where it goes ahead that now that the human genome is mapped, perhaps we will someday understand more precisely how behavior is affected by DNA. So the DNA we inherit, so they are on the process of studying even the DNA and how we behave, which are all biological factors. Our chromosomes, our hormones are all biological factors. So that is what they also believe in. So for example, in the weeks of immediately after the birth of a child, the level of testosterone in the father drops more than 30%. So that is how they study certain behavior of married couples. So it studies and it says that the biological psychologists explain behavior in a neurological terms. That is psychology on one hand and the structure of the brain and how it influences behavior. So that is one aspect. Then we have the evolutionary psychology as one of the new perspective. Evolutionary perspective of studying psychology. Now, the basic premise or the premise for this proponent is that the mind evolved to solve survival problems faced by our ancient ancestors. Our own mind is there to solve survival problems. That is what the evolutionary psychology is. That our mind has evolved. Our mind has evolved. So the central claim of them is that the brain evolved to solve problems encountered by our ancestors. So in doing so, they say that our behavior, they try to explain our behavior in terms of the pressures that shape our behavior. So sometimes if a hunter, for instance, feels hungry, then that hunger alone, because he wants to survive, move to the forest to hunt. So what the evolutionary psychology is saying is that in understanding the human mind, it is shaped by the pressures that we face. So it has evolved up to some point. So as it says, observed behavior is likely to have developed because it is adaptive. And that is the term, it is adaptive. We adapt to situations. We adapt to situations. So what we are seeing that the person is exhibiting is because the person is adapting to a situation or where he or she lives. So individuals who are best adapted to survive and reproduce. So behavior may be what? Sexually selected. For example, individuals who are most successful in gaining access to mates leave behind more offspring. That is the mind. So the mind is therefore equipped with instincts that enable our ancestors to survive and reproduce. So that is what this particular perspective is saying, that it tries to explain that behaviors are shaped by our pressures that we face. The pressures that we face. And they add that there are sexual selection example that we give. Now, its strength is that it can explain behaviors that seem irrational or harmful today. It explains behaviors that seem irrational or harmful today. Because we said earlier that such or our behavior is shaped by pressures that we face. Sometimes when you are faced with a certain condition or situation, you are going to behave abnormally. You are going to behave abnormally. But on an ordinary day, you are not going to behave as such. So according to them, this is why we have, or this is why bad things tend to happen. So they are not saying that in everything that we do, or it is good for us to act in certain manner, but all that they want to say is that we only adapt to situations. We only adapt to situations in our past. A behavior that help us to survive in our modern world. So that is their perspective with respect to that. Then earlier on, we spoke about the behavioralist perspective. The behavioralist perspective, where we said that our behavior is also controlled by the environment, which is similar to that of the evolutionary perspective. But with the evolutionary perspective, they were of the view that we behave by the pressures we face. Behave by the pressures we face. Now, the behavioralist perspective, the bottom line of this particular perspective of psychology is that people are controlled by their environment through learning. People are controlled by their environment through learning. So this states that our behavior is entirely a product of our learning. Our behavior is entirely a product of what? Our learning. So if sometimes we are asked to define what learning is, we normally say that learning is relatively permanent change in behavior. So in that manner, we mean that this perspective of psychology, that's the behavioralists, are saying that we are shaped by what we learn. Our behavior is entirely a product of what we learn. So for instance, if you learn that you put up a certain behavior, you are going to be rewarded, you continue to put up that behavior. So you have learned that such behavior will give you reward. That is why, as an HR person, you need to know of psychology, because once you reward an employee, it's a way of letting the person know that such behavior is good and must keep up doing it. Punishment. You punish somebody, the person learns from the punishment not to repeat that behavior. So that is what the behavioralist perspective are saying in respect of psychology, that we behave because of what we have learned. So a student, for example, will have to work hard, learn, because he or she has learned that such behavior has given him or her a good grade or praise from the teacher. So as a way of positive reinforcement, the person continues to put up that similar behavior. So that is basically what the behavioralist perspective is in respect of studying or understanding our behavior. So they propose two main processes whereby people learn from their environment. One is classical conditioning and one is operant conditioning. And are you doing okay, you are in level 200. operant conditioning and classical conditioning. And when we talk about the classical conditioning, as it has been given here, involves learning by association, and operant conditioning involves learning from consequences of behavior. So the operant conditioning uses reward, and the classical conditioning uses what? Learning by association. So I don't know if you've heard the story of the rat, where when it steps on the lever, that lever gives it food to eat. So the rat got to know that anytime it steps on it, it gives it food. So that stepping is the behavior, the food is the reward the person gets. So that is the operant conditioning. Now, the classical conditioning by association is that it means that we have two separate things that come together for the person to learn. Now, it was also used as an example where a rat, for instance, or a dog, the author or the one of the proponents of the behaviorist perspective in using the classical conditioning is that a bell is rung. A bell is rung, and they were studying how the dog will behave. So whenever a bell is rung, they don't see anything happening with the dog. But later, when he rang the bell, he places a meat in the dog's bowl, and the dog will come and eat. Ring the bell, place the meat there, the dog will come and eat. Ring the bell, the dog will come and eat the meat. Then later, he was ringing the bell without the meat. He was ringing the bell without the meat, but they saw that the dog was salivating. A lot of saliva because the dog is on the known that anytime the bell is rung, food presents itself. So whenever the dog hears the bells now, the dog salivates. So that is what we call by the classical condition. Learning by what? Association. So you associate one particular thing to another. You associate. So we call it a stimuli and a response. The stimuli is the bell, our environmental factors. The moment we hear something. So for example, gone are the days before we will go to church, or we get to know that church is about starting, we will hear them ringing the bell, that big bell. They ring the bell, and wherever you are, you know that it's time. If you look at our Muslim colleagues, when it's about time to pray, we hear them make a sound. They know that it's time to win. So the classical condition is that we learn by association. And that is what this perspective is also saying, that we are controlled by our environment. Our actions are controlled by the environment we live in. And the operant conditioning, as I was saying, anytime the rat steps on a lever, then it opens for food to come. So it went ahead to step on that lever so that the reward will come. So that is the operant conditioning that we also learn. We learn from consequences of our behavior. So if the consequence of our behavior is positive, we will continue to do. If it is negative, we stop or we refrain from doing. So that is what basically the behaviorist perspective is. Then we come to the psychodynamic perspective, as we saw with Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalysis theory. So with this particular perspective, adult behavior is determined by unconscious forces and childhood experience. Don't forget that we spoke about this particular psychoanalysis earlier by saying that they try to know our behavior from the unconsciousness to the consciousness. So according to him, the behavior that we see in an adult now is as a result of unconscious forces and childhood experiences. So that is a psychodynamic perspective. It looks at our inner world, what is hidden in us, and argues that the conscious mind is just a tip of the iceberg. What we see a person or what we see someone exhibiting in a form of behavior, the behavior we see on a person or a person acting, according to this perspective, it is a tip of the iceberg. We have a whole lot of things about a person that we don't know. So you, for instance, as a human resource management student, I think you study organizational behavior, management and organizational behavior, and you look at this iceberg theory. You also do change management. You know this iceberg theory, and when we talk about the iceberg, it's more or less like what we saw in Titanic. The ice was not just floating on the sea, but chunk of the ice was deep rooted in the sea. That is why when the ship hit the ice didn't go, but rather the ship was sinking, because deep into the sea, the ice was rooted in. So what they saw on the sea was just the small portion of it. So according to this perspective also, they akin it to this iceberg theory by saying that there are a whole lot of things that we don't even know about the person. And what the person is behaving or exhibiting now are unconscious forces that the person experienced during his or her childhood period. Who is that? So that is what the psychodynamic is, or theory is explaining. That he explained the human mind as, or like the iceberg, with only a small amount of it being visible. So that same thing of the Titanic that I said, it is the only small amount of the ice that we were seeing. So according to that, he is saying that our observable behavior constitutes so many unconscious efforts or unconscious mind. Then again, he was using this method to assess our unconsciousness. Now, according to him, for us to know why a person behaves or to know our inner world, for example, he was using our free association. So, for example, according to him, to know what is in the mind of a person, he was using slip of tongue. So you are talking and you say something else. So that slip of information that you give means that that is what is going through your mind. So they were using slip of tongue to understand the human mind. Dream analysis, our dreams, that it is our unconscious mind. That is what is going. So they were also using dream analysis to understand how we behave. And since we say something is unconscious, which is hidden, we need that special technique to uncover. So that is what he was using to study the mind. So that is in respect of this perspective with respect to the psychoanalysis. But however, as we said earlier, there were some criticisms with respect to that. That, as we saw with the behaviorism, where they were saying that something that is not seen cannot be observed, and therefore we only look at observable behavior. So that is what was one of their criticisms. But all that we are talking about is that with respect to the psychoanalysis, it was trying to steady their mind. Now, in studying the mind, they also hold that the mind is made up of three components. The first one is the id, our instinct. The second one is the ego, our reality. And the third one is the superego, our morality. So, according to him, he was proposing for the mental structure that always there is a conflict between what we believe in and the rules imposed on us and the realistic events that compromise how we act. So, according to him, what he is saying is that the mind is composed of these three things: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id is our instinct. So sometimes there are certain things that we do instinctively. There are certain things that is imposed on us. That's the superego, because of the society we come from. Then the ego, that is the reality. So there is conflict. So whenever our instincts and our morality, which is the superego, are in conflict, it is the ego that comes in to resolve it, because that is our reality. That is our reality. So whenever the id and the superego are in conflict, the ego comes in too. So what it's trying to say is that our instincts has to do with what we are made of. Now we are also brought into a society, a community that has rules, that has norms, beliefs. So our behavior is shaped by these beliefs. But as we grow up, we now face the reality. So sometimes the instinct is that do this. The rule is also saying that when you don't do this. Now the reality comes in, which is the ego. For instance, we were told that when we are bathing, we shouldn't talk. Something will happen. But unconsciously, you pour water on you and you start to sing. Then you remember, hey, they say when we are bathing, we shouldn't talk. Now there is conflict. Then the ego comes in. So if I sing, what at all will happen? Then you try to sing and see what does happen. Then nothing happens. So that is what he is saying. So, for instance, you work in an organization and you see that, for instance, one of your employees is feeling angry. That person is feeling angry towards the boss. That is the person's instinct. The id is the impulse. Anger is our impulse. But knows that it is unacceptable to yell at the boss. That is the rule, the superego. So the impulse is the person is angry and want to yell to be free. But the rule is that you cannot do that at the workplace. So the ego comes in to calm the person that at this particular point, is it right to do it or do so or not? So that is when the superego comes in. So a person who has angry feeling towards a boss, but knows it is unacceptable to yell, might use a defense mechanism of displacement and go home angrily. So sometimes that is why somebody will do something in a public space and you get angry, but because of where you are. So the reality is that your ego will tell you that leave the scene. Then you leave the scene, because if you are there, you may never know what you do. So according to him, that is what the mind is made up of. It is made up of these three things: our instinct that causes us to act, then the superego, that is the rules imposed on us, and the ego is our reality. The ego is our reality, and that comes in whenever there is conflict between our instinct and our superego. So that is the psychodynamic theory, or the psychoanalysis. And as I said, it also had some criticisms. But however, it has also contributed in the studying of psychology. So now we look at the goals of psychology. Any question before we move to the goals of psychology? Any question?
No, sir.
So you understand everything? Okay. Then with the goals of psychology, we are saying that there are four main goals of psychology: to describe, to explain, to predict, and to change the behavior and mental processes of others. So these are the four main goals. Psychology aims to describe why we behave in certain manner, give description that this is what we are doing. Then the explanation is why we behave in that manner. Then it also predicts what we are capable of doing in the future. And sometimes when the behaviors that we exhibit are not good or appropriate, it tries to change such behavior. So these are the four main goals of psychology. So we look at the first one: to describe. The goal of psychology is to describe behavior accurately and objectively. And it says that, so before we can explain anything, we must know what we are looking at. That's the description. Before we can explain anything, we must know what we are looking at. And this involves observation, measurement, to create that clear picture. So we want to describe something. So for instance, you are asked to go and watch a football match, and you are being told, so okay, when you went, what happened? You are giving a description. So you went to observe. But in psychology, for instance, we say unbiased observation. Every individual is biased. So if you go and watch a football match, probably you support a particular team. So in your description, you may be biased. But such observation will help you to now describe in a clear picture of what happened. So before we are able to explain why people obey authority, a psychologist must first describe what obedience look like. So you describe, when we say somebody is obedient, what does the person do? You realize that the person uses please, adhere to. And why do you think the person is obedient? That's the explanation. So the first aim is to describe behavior accurately and objectively. Now, the second one is to explain. Are you there?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. The second one is to explain, as we can see. Yes, we know what obedience is. Now explain to us why it is like that. So the explanation is simply the causes of our behavior. Why do you think we behave in a certain manner? So as I said earlier, the description tells us what, and the explanation seeks to know why.
Sir, please kindly take it again.
What I'm saying is that the first goal of psychology is to describe. And I'm saying that description tells us what it is, and explanation seeks to know why it is like that. So psychology will first tell us what the thing is. Then, secondly, explain why it is like that.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
So, for example, using the obedience as it is, having described obedience rates or high obedience rate, you have described that, oh, in with these people, this particular community, the people there are obedient. So you tell us what those people are. Why do you think they are obedient to authorities like that? Then it could be that people surrender their responsibility to authority because they perceive it as what? Legitimate. They see it that it is legitimate to be obedient. So that is the explanation towards why they want to what, or why they are obedient, that they perceive it as legitimate. So all that we need to know is that another goal of psychology is to explain our behavior, is to explain our behavior. So a typical example is the classical conditioning, which is the explanation and the behavior to explain why we behave. Also, psychology, one of the goals of psychology is to predict. So the third goal is to predict future behavior under certain conditions. So psychology, all the theories that explain psychology, they do not only explain the past, but also forecast the future. So that is the goal of the psychology, to also predict. So if prediction is not confirmed, then explanation might be based on then the explanation it is based on needs to be revised. Is it a hand that I'm seeing? Abigail, your hand is up. You're on mute. You've muted yourself. You've muted yourself. Your hand is up, or it's a mistake. You've muted yourself. We can't hear you. Okay. So psychology only not explain why certain events happen, but or why our certain behavior happen. It is also able to predict that such behavior will continue in the future or will not continue in the future. Then the last one is to change. One of the behavior is to change. Once psychology has described, explained, and made predictions about behavior, changing or controlling behavior can be attempted. Changing or controlling behavior can be attempted. If you're able to know why a person smokes, you are able to now put in measures to change the person from smoking, because you know why the person is smoking, and also predict that it will continue if certain things are not done. So it also helps you to change behavior. So these are the 4 main aims of psychology.
Sir, please, a question.
Okay.
Please, when we are talking about the predicts, please, you made mention they do not only explain the past, but also, I didn't get that aspect.
Also, the future occurrence of that behavior. So what we are saying is that psychology or psychologists will describe, explain why it is happening, and also predict the occurrence of that behavior. And they don't only predict, they also attempt to change that behavior if, for instance, it is not good. So it is just combining these 4 together that psychologists describe, explain, predict, and change behavior.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so now we look at some branches of psychology. And by branches, we're looking at where it is being used. So all that the branches is telling us is that psychology has specialized areas. It can be categorized in a different institutions or regions. And it is trying to tell us that it is not a single job. It is not one single job when it comes to psychology. It is a diverse field with a lot of specialty. That's what it is trying to say. Since we said that psychology is the intersection of much more disciplines, since psychology is a intersection of much more discipline, we also see that it has a lot of branches. It has a lot of branches. So we look at the first one, clinical psychology. Clinical psychology.
Hello, sir.
Here we go.
Sir, please, my question was about the predict future behavior.
Okay.
Please, I was not getting it. Is it the individual or the HR officer?
Okay, so for instance, if the HR officer is a psychologist, now the HR officer has seen that employees are underperforming. How are they underperforming? You describe when they come to work, they lay down their tools. They have extended breaks. Instead of them to have break for 1 hour, they go for 2 hours. So you are explaining, or sorry, describing their underperformance. Now the question is, why are they underperforming? Why are they underperforming? So they are underperforming because for the past 2 months they have not been paid, or they are asking for increments and they have not been paid. That is why they are behaving. So this is the explanation. The first one is what? The description. Describing their underperformance, long breaks, putting their tools down, lazing around, and that is the underperformance. Why do you think they are doing so? Upon investigation, you realize that it is because of the increment they asked for that they didn't get or they are not getting. So you are explaining that behavior of underperformance or poor performance. Then you also predict, you're able to predict that if such thing is not done, such increment is not given, it will continue in the next year or in the future. Tomorrow is future. So they will still continue. So that is why they are also able to predict. So looking at why they are behaving in that manner, if care is not taken, the same thing is likely to happen. And even those that are under them, that are also observing, may also end up putting up similar behavior. So that is the prediction. So the HR manager is also making prediction about their employees that if certain things are not done. Now, the very fact that you are able to explain why they are behaving in this way means that you can attempt to change that. And that is the change aspect. So maybe you are not going to meet them in full, but you meet them halfway. So if you are asking for 10% increment, you negotiate with them and say, okay, 5. Then once you increase their salary by 5%, then you see that now they come to work early, they adhere to time, they don't lazy around. So you have changed the behavior of an underperformance or poor performance to a better performance. So that is basically an analogy of how or what psychologists aim to achieve by first describing their behavior, explaining why they behave, and predicting the occurrence of that behavior. And lastly, attempt to change that behavior. Are you okay?
Yes, sir. So, sir, that means the 4 main goals. It goes to the HR manager alone.
What do you mean by it goes to the HR manager alone?
Because he predicts the future and then describe the behavior of the personnel. So I liked your explanations.
So that's why I said that as an HR person, you need to know psychology because you are also managing people in the organization. And we said that psychology is a social science. So as you managing people in the organization, you need to understand their behavior because psychology is the study of human behavior. So why are they behaving that? So you are supposed to know, first describe their behavior, explain why they are behaving in that manner.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we look at some branches, and as I said, because psychology is a vast field, there are a lot of specialty in it. So we look at the first one, clinical psychology, which relates psychologists to directly providing comprehensive health care to patients who are suffering from mental illness. So that's the clinical psychology. So it's a branch of psychology that studies, diagnoses, and treats mental illness. So a clinical psychologist is more or less like a doctor of the mind. A doctor of the mind. They work directly with patients that is suffering from psychological disorder, using interviews, tests, and observation to understand their problem and create a treatment plan for them. So it is for us to just know the psychological or the clinical parts of psychology. Then we have also the cognitive psychology. The cognitive psychology. What the cognitive psychology simply is that it's a branch of psychology that studies the internal mental process, like the thinking, the memory, and the language, as we saw as one of the perspective, the cognitive perspective. So the same explanation here, where we said that with the cognitive perspective, they try to look at the mind as a software, how it's acquire information, how it's processing the information, and how it stores the information. Then we also have the developmental psychology. The developmental psychology, which helps us to understand how people mature over the course of their life, both emotionally and physically. That is the developmental psychology. How people grow, how people change physically, how people change emotionally from birth to old age. So that is the developmental psychology. It is a branch of psychology that looks at our entire life span. We go through certain stages from infancy to adulthood. So that is the developmental psychology. And as a perspective, we also looked at evolutionary perspective, where we said that our behavior is shaped by the pressures that we face. We evolve from our past experience. So that is also a branch of the psychology. Then the health psychology, that's the medicine, the medical psychology, which is also a branch that helps us to observe our biological and social context. That's the health psychology. That branch of psychology that studies behavior and the biological aspects. Then we have the neuropsychology. And as we said, we saw earlier, the neuropsychology looks at the brain, and try to link the brain to our behavior. So the study between the structure of the brain and our behavior process. So that is what we are supposed to know. Then occupational psychology. Occupational psychology. And what the occupational psychology is a branch of psychology that applies psychology to the workplace. So just as you are human resource student, management student, you study what we call industrial and occupational psychology as a course. So we are going to study the workplace, what goes on in the workplace. So we have organizational psychology or occupational psychology. So it defines industrial and occupational psychology. It explains why industrial and organizational psychology, it deals with how we select employees, how we train employees, how we motivate leadership are all things that happen in the organization. So it is also a branch with respect to psychology. Then we have also social psychology. Social psychology. Just as we said earlier, that psychology in this sense is a social science which deals with how individuals behave, our feelings, our thoughts, by or in the presence of people, how we behave towards people. That is a social psychology. It's a branch that studies power of a society. So it studies topics like aggression, persuasion, and stuff. These are all psychologies. These are all branches of psychology. Now, we also have some theories of psychologies, and most of these theories, we have already explained them as part of either a branch or early theories or early perspective of psychology. Now, what we have here is that a theory is based on hypothesis and backed by evidence. In science, theory is not merely a guess. When we say a theory, it is not merely a guesswork. It is something that has been observed. So, for example, as it is saying that a theory is based on hypothesis and backed by evidence. You know, we all know this hypothesis that the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. That is an hypothesis, a hypothesis. And in this case, it is not just a simple guess that when prices are high, the quantity demanded of that product will be low. They have monitored and studied a lot of consumers and realized that whenever the prices are high, they reduce the quantity. That is why they came up with that theory. So when we say theory, it is not a merely guess. It is a fact-based finding that describe a phenomenon. So the proponent of each theory that we are going to state or explain is that such proponent studied humans for some time and came out with that particular explanation about psychology. So that is what it is. So now we look at the first one in terms of the psychological theories. And by looking at the first one, it says that psychological theory has two components. It must describe a behavior, and it must also predict about the future behavior. And that is what we saw as part of the goals of the psychology. So the description of the behavior must be known, and its prediction must also be known. So now let's look at some of the type of the theories. Developmental theories. Developmental theories. Just as we saw at the development, that as a branch, that they study the human behavior in terms of how we grew up, the stages that we were in respect of from childbirth to adulthood. So this developmental theories, what it tries to do is that it tries to describe and explain growth and changes across our lifespan. And that is what we spoke about. And there are some theories that we can find in these developmental theories. The psychosocial theory by Erikson. We have a lot of theories that we can find it under the developmental theory. The Kohlberg's theory and the Erikson theory of psychosocial development. All this theory is trying to explain and describe human development, how we develop as a human. So yours is to know that we have these developmental theories. Then we have also grand theories. Grand theories. When we talk about grand theories, it's defined as a comprehensive or a broad framework proposed by most thinkers to explain vast areas of behavior. That's a grand theory. So a typical example is the psychodynamic theory. It is a theory which is also known as a grand theory, which explains majority of human behavior. So if a theory is able to explain majority of our behavior, we call it what? The grand theory. For example, the psychodynamic theory, trying to explain personality, our motivation through the lens of unconscious drive that we have, where we saw the three components, the id, the ego, and the superego. That is a psychoanalytic theory. That sometimes we are faced in a situation where our ego, which is a relative, comes in to resolve the conflict between our instinct and the rules imposed on us. So that is some example of the grand theory. Then we also have a mini theory. If we are saying that the grand theory explains majority of human behavior, then what the mini theory also does is sometimes explain the very specific ones. Here it is not broad, the very specific or narrow aspects of human behavior. So that is also the mini theory. They don't look at broad areas of human behavior, but the specific ones or the narrow ones. Now we also have the emergent theory. As the name is emergent, if something is emergent, it means it is new, it is now coming. So emergent theories are defined as newer theories, evolving theories that combines the ideas of the mini theories. So you see, the mini theories are ones that look at specific narrow ones. So when we combine these narrow ones, we can now come and get a modern theory to explain. So emergent is new theories that is coming. And a typical example of an emergent theory is what? The Vygotsky socio cultural theory. It's an emergent theory of development. It's a new theory that is trying to explain human development. It proposes that cognitive ability is primarily driven by our social interactions. But yours is to know that as part of the theories, we also have emergent theories. Emergent theories. Now we look at also different psychological theories, the behavioral theories that we spoke about, the cognitive theories, the developmental theories, the humanistic theories, where we saw earlier that for us to understand why a person behaves, we need to understand the whole of the person, know from the person's viewpoint, if you remember. So it is also a theory, personality theory, which help us to understand the personality of people. And you know, we have the 5 big personality traits: the introversion, the extroversion, the agreeableness, the openness to experience. These are personality traits. So this theory tries to explain patterns of thought, feelings, and behavior that make up a unique person. So if you say somebody is introvert, what constitutes a person who is an introvert? They studied these people for a number of years to now come up with such theory about a personality. Then social psychology theory, which explains how we understand and explain social behavior in terms of a specific society, group of people. Now, in studying psychology, there are also challenges. So yours is to get, so that's why I took my time to explain the initial aspects. So once you understand, it will enable you to understand the other ones. And some of the earlier perspective and also the new development that we saw, they emanated into theories, into branches. So when you look at them, you realize that there are big similarities in the branches we saw, the theories we saw, and the newer perspective we saw. Yes, yes, Cynthia.
Please, I think our time is up. We have just less than 15 minutes before
For another, okay.
for another
Okay,
lesson.
so let me just, in 1 minute, let me just wrap up with. So I think that is what psychology is. So we need to find time and look at the challenges and the benefits of psychology and also the methods. This one will not even take us 20 minutes, but it will eat into your time. So probably we'll find time to look at that. But based on the ones that we have done, the whole discussion is that psychology is a scientific study of the mind and behavior. And the mind is complex to study. And that's for us to know what goes through the mind is our behavior, which is why we saw the human behavior as a data to studying the mind. So we're able to know what goes through the mind in terms of our behavior. Then we had earlier history or earlier perspective of how to study psychology or the human mind. The structuralism, where the human mind was constructed into components. Then the functionalism says that we cannot compact or deconstruct the mind, but rather what is the mind used for, the purpose. So they serve the foundation for studying the psychology, which gives room for other perspective to come in, which is the behaviorist, the humanistic, the evolutionary. They all came, and they also form the branches. They also form the theories with respect to psychology. So it is all about studying the human mind and the behavior of human beings. And that the goal is to describe, explain, predict, and change human behavior. So this is just, by the way, for us to understand and apply it in our workplace. Now, when you study psychology very well, you end up to understand why people behave in a certain manner. And sometimes you don't even get angry at them because you know where they are coming from. So I think I will leave you here and we find time to we agree on a time to discuss the challenges, the benefits, and the research that we can do to understand psychology. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Abigail, so we can,
Sir,
yeah,
are we meeting today again? Because per our timetable, we have general psychology 11:30, 10:30 to 11:30. I don't know.
Sir, yes.
okay. So if
Yes.
you have 1 hour, 10:30 to 11:30.
Sir,
Yes.
yes.
Okay, so probably you meet at that time, but it depends on the other group also if they have it at the same time. So what are they going to do with the 9:30 to the 10:30? Do they have class? Do you
I
have
think
class?
others have.
Sir, yes.
Yeah. Okay, all right, okay. So then let's pause here when it's time. So Doreen, when it's time, kindly alert me so that we continue
Okay.
with the challenges and the benefits. Thank you.
Where is that, Doreen?
Yay. Hey, it's
Please.
Matilda.
Yes. How are you?
I'm good. How are you too?
I know. Please, the link you posted there is not opening. No.
Hey, please. Please, may
I
we
think
know
I'm
our
not the
course
one
rep?
who posted
We
it,
don't
so
know
I
our
will try
course
and
rep.
post
Oh.
it to you.
Yo, thank you very much. Please, are you the court rep?
So who
Yeah.
is our course rep, please?
No, please. No, please.
Yo, can you post it to me?
Doreen,
Thank
please, I
you.
want to make this thing better.